Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. With me today is the co-host, Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Daniel, we have a special guest here today who's been a friend of Liberty. He's a professor at Loyola University in Maryland and also a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. So he obviously has to be one of the good guys. And he's written a recent book called The Problem with Socialism, written by Tom DiLorenzo. Tom, welcome to the program.
Pleased to be with you, Ron. How are you?
Well, doing well, and I'm delighted that you're with us today to dispel all the myths about socialism. I think socialism has been around a long time. Free markets and capitalism has been around a long time too, but there's always a struggle from the beginning of time between freer markets versus more controlled markets. So I want to get started by trying to get the best definition, at least from your viewpoint, of what socialism is all about, because sometimes that term is thrown around by conservatives, sometimes libertarians, and they'll call so-and-so a socialist, and technically it might not fit my definition, or it might not even be satisfactory to a Mises definition of what socialism is. So tell us how you define socialism, and maybe what are the tipping points of moving a society like we have to an economy like we have today, which Mises predicted would become more socialistic. What might be the tipping point to push us over into true socialism?
Okay, well, in my book, I have 16 chapters, so I cover a lot of ground. And the definition of socialism, the original definition, was government ownership of the means of production, nationalization, and so forth. But then I also quote The Road to Serfdom, where Hayek, in the 1976 edition, he said that the meaning of socialism had evolved by that time to include the redistribution of income through the welfare state and the progressive income tax. And I agree with him there, that the ends were always ostensibly equality or egalitarianism, but the means evolved to include the welfare state and the progressive income tax. And then the third thing I say in my introduction to the book is that in Ludwig von Mises' book, Socialism, he says that socialists have always had a dual strategy. One, to nationalize as much property as possible, but two, he called it destructionism, to destroy the private property, free enterprise system with taxes, regulation, inflation, whatever can work. And so my book covers all three of those things. It covers redistributionism, nationalization or government-run enterprises. I have a chapter called Islands of Socialism, the Follies of Government Enterprise, for example. And then also destructionism, the effects of regulation and excessive taxation and so forth.
Do you say that we have a socialist economy right now, or just moving in that direction?
Well, I address that. I look at, if you add up all the taxes from federal, state, and local government and divide it by national income, according to the government's own statistics, you get between 35 and 40%, depending on what year you gather these statistics from. But if you add on top of that these 75,000 pages in the Federal Register, 15 cabinet departments that regulate all aspects of industry, and state and local governments that have all sorts of regulatory functions, then I think the government either owns or controls almost half of the U.S. economy. And I did have an op-ed in Breitbart a couple days ago called America's Tipping Point. And I think we are at a tipping point when we have this current election, where you have Hillary Clinton advocating a $5,000 check for every new baby born, and free, quote, free higher education for everyone with income under $125,000. And there's no reason why, if she got elected, she wouldn't quickly make that $200,000. There's more votes there, so why not? And so we're looking at a possible vast expansion of the welfare state in the coming years if that happens.
Well, the most dramatic change in our economy that I was aware of course, I frequently talk about it because of the monetary issues of closing down the Bretton Woods system August 15th of 1971. They also put on wage and price controls. And boy, the economy collapsed. Shortages overnight. It was a total despair. So the pricing mechanism is really pretty important, at least when you see the destruction of socialism. So that obviously is a major thing, and of course Mises makes the point that that's why socialism always fails, or there's no market pricing.
That's right. That's absolutely essential, market pricing. We see that in Venezuela today, where Hugo Chavez adopted socialism in 1999, and with pervasive price controls was a part of it, and nationalization. And so today you read stories all over the internet about people, middle-class people, rooting through garbage in the streets looking for something to eat. They have hyperinflation now of 1,600%. I read in the New York Times that a hamburger in Venezuela costs the equivalent of $170 today, and anyone who can leave the country is leaving. And they've destroyed their country in about 15 years worth of socialism. And it's interesting, Ron, that not too long ago, Univision, the Latin American television network, asked Bernie Sanders if he had an opinion of the economic implosion of Venezuela and Argentina, and he said no comment, for obvious reasons.
Daniel?
You know, Tom, you make a mention earlier on about Hillary's check to new babies and free college and all this. Well, I'm wondering about another candidate's suggestion, or at least something that's made the rounds in Twitter, and this is Gary Johnson. You know, he was asked at Freedom Fest what his view was of a universal basic income. Now, that's where the government, as you know, the government will guarantee everyone a minimum amount of money. And while he did not jump on board, he said he was certainly open to the idea, and that he would he's attracted to it because it would reduce costs through less bureaucracy. Would you categorize this attraction to this sort of a project socialism?
Well, of course. That's my old friend Walter Williams, who's a great speech maker. He goes up to audiences of college students and surprises them by saying, "What would you call a program that forced one person to work for the benefit of another person?" In these room full of students, I've seen this in person. They think for about 5 seconds and they say slavery is what that is. And then, what else would you call the welfare state, where you force one person to work for the benefit of another person? And that's one aspect of that. Yet the Charles Murray, who sometimes calls himself a libertarian, also wrote a whole book about this, advocating a basic government income. The Swiss took a vote on it about a month or so ago and rejected it, fortunately for the Swiss people. And it would just be a vast expansion of the welfare state. And it's hard to believe that any new government program would result in less bureaucracy. That's like saying putting more money in a swimming pool will make the water shallower rather than deeper.
Do you have a follow-up? Okay. Tom, I wanted to get your opinion about the so-called success, or the apparent political success of Bernie Sanders, because he talked on campuses, got large crowds out. He got larger crowds out than I did, and I thought I did fairly well. And he didn't mince words. He said he believed in socialism. And I'm interested in your opinion about young people now, not so much when they're leaving your university, but as they arrive to your university and what their perceptions are. And do you think the young people are definitely leaning more towards socialism? Is this a horrendously bad sign of what Sanders was talking to, or is there still hope for some of those young people that I'm still talking to over the years? Because I'm a little bit more optimistic, but it's not as easy for me to say, well, we have a lot of young people, they're interested in self-reliance and they don't want to be like Venezuela. What's your assessment of the young people today?
Yeah, well, that's why I wrote this book. The target audience is the millennials and their parents. But, there was this Pew Foundation poll that said 69% of voters under 30 said they could vote for a socialist for president. And that's kind of an alarming thing. But it's been my experience, though, that, I had Bernie Sanders supporters in my class last semester. And this was a class of freshmen and sophomores. And I just asked them, I said things to them like, well, I don't work for free. My doctor doesn't work for free. And so how could it be that education or healthcare could be free? Somebody's got to pay for it. And many of them had looks on their faces like it was the first time anyone had ever brought that up, that there is no such thing as a free lunch. And then once I teach them about opportunity cost, which is a pretty simple lesson, they get it, they understand it. And several of them, the students in my class, turned into people who resented Bernie Sanders because it struck them that he was playing them as fools by offering them something for nothing. And I found that they're also very interested. I put the debt clock up on a screen on my classroom. It's this clock that has, it moves about 10,000 miles an hour as every dollar of government spending adds to national debt. And they understand that this is their bill to pay, that this is going to be on their backs to pay. And they become very concerned about that. So I think a little bit of education like this and basic economics can go a long way in persuading a lot of these. A lot of my students are big fans of the television show Shark Tank. They like the idea of being independent entrepreneurs and making money. And so the millennial generation is bifurcated. You got these Bernie Sanders followers who are not very well educated, but I hope education can change that around.
Well, I recall something Leonard Read said when I confronted with this about numbers. There are more socialist appeal for Bernie Sanders versus some of our meetings. And Leonard would always say it's not a numbers game. It's that 7 or 8 or 9% of individuals who are the thought leaders in the country. People like you that are teaching young people, the people that are involved with the Mises Institute. And those numbers don't necessarily have to match up. So that gives me a little bit of encouragement that we think about the ideology and rather than the superficiality of some people who can get attention with offering free stuff. I guess it's hard to turn down free stuff unless they run into a professor like you or Walter Williams that realize, explain to me how something is free.
Right. Well, I ask my students, do you believe in Santa Claus? And of course they think, what is this about? Why is he asking us if they believe in Santa Claus? And then I ask them, well, why do you believe that politicians can give you something for free? Aren't they playing Santa Claus? That's where does that come from? And so if you reach them initially at that kind of level, I think it can be pretty effective, and they tend to understand what's going on here.
Professor, you mentioned Shark Tank and how young people are attracted to this idea of entrepreneurialism. What I was wondering, looking through your book, and obviously we're not going to be Venezuela overnight. We're not going to be digging through the trash cans in the middle class here. But what I wonder, and I don't know if you want to address this, but what about the cultural damage that happens with this sort of acceptance of the idea of socialism? It used to be a 4-letter word. I grew up in the 80s when we were just seeing the end of the Soviet Union. We never thought that it would make a comeback. I'd seen in an article, and I don't have it in front of me, but there was a big decrease in starting new businesses over the last year, I guess it was. So what about the cultural implications of the acceptance of the idea of socialism?
Well, there's some real dangers out there. When I Google my own book, The Problem with Socialism, to see what people might be saying about it, and if you go on Amazon and it pops up, the book next to it is called The Problem with Work, and it's by a Marxist professor. This is something, von Mises wrote about this in Human Action, that one of the targets of the socialists has been to demonize the whole idea of work. They claim that the capitalists force us into this. They force us into being wage slaves. And so some of this is taught in the universities, that, work is a bad thing. Maybe you should just take half a year off and live a minimal existence. It's one thing to have people who are just plain lazy, but other people to have an ideology behind laziness and being unproductive people. That's another thing. And so they're sort of cultivating welfare parasites by demonizing work in at least part of the academic world. And that's a very bad cultural impact, I think. Another thing I'm concerned about is, the egalitarians in academia, they want to use government to force equality on all fronts, not just income, but everything. Men and women should be equal in all aspects, and we should not even talk about differences in biological differences between men and women anymore. It's uncouth to even do that, and I think that's a ridiculous direction to go in. Murray Rothbard once said that there's a reason why people sort of lampoon this idea of equality and by citing extreme examples of it, because that's what totalitarian societies have always used as their excuse for totalitarianism, to force us into being equal. And so that's a very dangerous trend.
Yeah, just remember, all animals are equal, except some are more equal than others, is what happened. Yeah. I wanted to follow up on something you mentioned when we were talking about Venezuela. You know, the description of what happens under socialism. It breaks down, people go hungry, and the system doesn't work. But you said prices were very high, too. And yet today there's tremendous economic confusion, you know, with this outfit called the Federal Reserve, because they have a precise policy of if we only can get prices to go up and depreciate and devalue the money at least 2% or more, then that will be a sign of economic growth. But I think what most people forget, and they never get taught, except in under special circumstances where we have some Austrian economists teaching, and that is that you can have inflationary depressions, and that inflation is depressive to the economy, and yet this whole thing of the Federal Reserve being designed, if we could only get 2+ prices going up and ruin anybody who wants to save money, then we wonder why this system fails.
One of the chapters in my book is called Destroying Capitalism by Socializing Capital, and it's about the Fed, among other things. It's a short chapter. It's not a big treatise on the Fed. But yeah, the Fed causes boom and bust cycles. And another example I can cite is Sweden. You know, Bernie Sanders and the rest, they tout democratic socialism. Well, Venezuela, by the way, is a democratic country. But Sweden, when their economy imploded in the 1980s, because they had tried to print their way into prosperity, their welfare state began to collapse of its own weight. So they had hyperinflation, and they had 500% interest rates in Sweden, and that was a calamity, but it was caused by their central bank. And isn't it ironic that the Nobel Prize in Economic Science, by the way, is sponsored by the Swedish central bank? It's not sponsored by Alfred Nobel and the Nobel Foundation. It's a Swedish central bank that once created 500% interest rates in their own country, and we're supposed to look up to them as the world's experts in all things correct with regard to economics.
Right. We're getting near the end of the program, but there is time for another question that fascinates me, because you have a chapter on this, and I get asked this, or they charge me with this idea. Oh yeah, we want socialism, but not like Venezuela, or not like Mussolini socialism. We want good socialism. An example in the Scandinavian countries, they're the good guys. Tell us a little bit of the shortcomings of that type of an argument.
Well, to use Sweden as an example again, Sweden was a great free market capitalist society in the late 19th, early 20th century. Beginning in 1870, they had the highest per capita income growth in the world for 50 years. And then the socialists took over. They nationalized industry. They adopted a huge welfare state, steeply progressive income taxes. And according to the Swedish Economic Association, there was not one single net new job created in Sweden from 1950 until 2005. 55 years of zero job growth. So they basically ate up all their capital, and then that's at the point where they reached where they had already tried to print their way out of trouble by printing vast amounts of money. And they did have some reforms in Sweden. They deregulated, they privatized some industries, they cut marginal income tax rates, and made a bit of a comeback since then. But the per capita income in Sweden is still lower than Mississippi, which is our poorest state. Wow. So it's hard to be a role model for us.
So they want some people want us to emulate the Scandinavian countries and Sweden, and avoid all the pitfalls, which is obviously not going to be possible, because I think the ideas of collectivism are alive and well, but I'm still the perpetual optimist, believing individuals like you and others who are out there changing people's minds that there is a difference. And the other thing is I think there's a vacuum out there, and this thing is going to come apart, and maybe we'll do much better than Venezuela by providing an alternative to it. But Tom, I want to thank you very much for being with us today, and I want to advise our listeners to make sure they get a copy of this. I'm sure it can be found on Amazon. And It's a great little book and not that expensive, so you can buy several and pass them around. Tom, thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks, Daniel, for the brilliant questions.
And I want to thank our audience for being with us today, because this is obviously an issue that is very important and timely when we've just gone through an election where an avowed socialist did quite well. And it tells us that we have a job ahead. We have to refute it. We have to do it intellectually. We have to offer a better idea, and we have the opportunity, because socialism fails. Socialism can't work. It didn't work in the Soviet system or the Mussolini system or the Venezuela system. And as Tom just described, it didn't work in Sweden either, if you look at the true facts of the matter and just not gloss over them. So socialism is just armed might forced by the government. It's not freedom. And the best example I think Tom did was citing Walter Williams, that said, when you take from one and give to the other, what's this called? And these individuals who lean toward socialism, they say, oh, if you take from one by force and give to another, that's called slavery. Well, that's what socialism is all about. And it's slavery in the economic sense. And when you have an authoritarian government that imposes social regulations and telling people how to live, it's a form of slavery and domination and tyranny. In the same way overseas, if we do it with foreign nations and tell other people what to do, it's the same type of use of force which always fails and doesn't work, and that is what we have to refute. And that is refuted by the principle of the non-aggression principle, that we should accept this idea that nobody, especially government, can't use force to make and remake the world, cannot regulate the economy and not tell how people should live. Under those conditions, I do believe that we could have peace and prosperity. Thank you very much for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.